Bret Stephens is a Pulitzer Prize winning American conservative journalist, editor, and columnist. He began working as an opinion columnist at the New York Times in late April 2017 and as a senior contributor to NBC News in June 2017. He previously worked at the Wall Street Journal as a foreign affairs columnist, and from 2002 to 2004 was editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, and he won a Pulitzer Prize for commentary in 2013. Bret Stephens earned an undergraduate degree in political philosophy from the University of Chicago and a master's degree in comparative politics right around the corner at the London School of Economics. And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome and give a very warm welcome to Bret Stephens. Thank you so much for making yourself available for joining us this evening.
Well, Rabbi, thank you for inviting me to join your online community. That's the way we all are these days. As a matter of fact, I think purely by coincidence, this morning I did a podcast with Tom Gross, who is a journalist also based in London, the son of the very distinguished critic and Shakespeare scholar, John Gross. So this is my second appearance in the UK in the space of, I think, just a few hours. I'm really delighted to be part of this. It is 14 days before the US election, and I suspect that even though you're not an American audience, you might want a little bit of insight as to just what is going on here and what you might expect in the weeks ahead. I'm not exactly proud of the way American politics has played out in the last few years, but I think we deserve at least some credit for providing world-class entertainment on your evening news feed week in and week out. So there are two prevailing narratives about how this election is going to go. The first narrative, to borrow the title of a wonderful memoir by a former New York Times reporter, is that it's all over but the shoutin', to use a Southern expression. In the latest New York Times poll, Joe Biden holds a commanding 50% to 41% lead over President Trump when it comes to all of the major issues on people's minds: the economy, the coronavirus crisis, the state of society. And usually when a candidate gets to that 50% mark, historically it's meant that they have won the election. So that is, I think, the conventional wisdom as we're moving into these final 2 weeks. Joe Biden will become president. He will probably have, according to the conventional wisdom, a narrow majority in the Senate, which means that Democrats will have full control of government beginning on January 20th. And assuming that President Trump doesn't try to stay in office somehow, it's unclear how he might do that, we're going to have a new administration and a new party next year. Now, against that narrative is a different one, and if I can borrow another great American line, this one from the Jewish novelist William Goldman, nobody knows nothing. That's nothing, N-U-T-H-I-N, in case you're wondering about the spelling. And I am a follower of the nobody knows nothing way of thinking for at least two major reasons. The first of them is that if you had spoken to any of the major pollsters or senior pundits 2 weeks before the 2016 election, they would have told you with equal confidence that there was simply no chance of Donald Trump winning the elections. All the polls had Hillary Clinton way ahead. Trump seemed to be going from debacle to debacle, most famously his uh, infamous lines about where he liked to grab women as a celebrity. And it looked like the Republicans were heading to a defeat of historic proportion. Now, obviously, that didn't happen, and it's worth keeping this data point in your minds. At this point in 2016, that is to say, with 14 days to go before the election, Hillary Clinton held a lead in the key battleground states of 4.4, an average of 4.4 percentage points. Those are the states like North Carolina, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Florida, and one or two others where this election is most likely to be ultimately decided. Today, as compared to Hillary's 4.4%, Joe Biden holds an average lead in those battleground states of just 3.9%. So Biden is doing comparatively worse than Hillary Clinton was at the same point in time. Second reason I have doubts as to whether Biden is going to win is that even though, unlike Hillary Clinton, he is not widely disliked by the American public, he inspires a very uh, lukewarm reception among most people, including most Democrats. So there is an enthusiasm gap between Biden and Trump that is formidable. The third reason I think it's very important to note this is that when pollsters in the United States try to conduct polling, they are ultimately taking wild guesses as to just who is likely to actually vote in the election. And some of the polling makes me suspect that these pollsters are oversampling some demographics and undersampling others. Just to give you an example, Georgia, which historically has been a deep red state for the Democratic Party.
You have to keep that.
Georgia, which has historically been a deep red state, a Republican state, and where the Republican Senate candidate looks like he is winning handily, has Biden nominally with a 1 percentage point lead in the polls. That to me just suggests that the pollsters really don't know who the voter is likely to be. So anyone who is assuming that Biden is going to be the next president, in my view, ought to rethink that assumption carefully. I'm not saying that Trump is going to win, but I am saying that this election is very much up for grabs. What does all of this mean for us, the Jews? And this is a much more vexing question. The Jewish vote itself is overwhelmingly going to go for Joe Biden. Jews have voted overwhelmingly, at least outside of the Orthodox communities in the United States. Jews have voted overwhelmingly for Democratic candidates for decades. You probably have to go almost a century back to 1932 or 1928 to find the last time American Jews, majority of American Jews, voted the Republican ticket. So American Jews are likely to vote for Biden, and they're doing so for reasons which are understandable on two grounds. Understandable first, because American Jews, in their broader political outlook, tend to be, as we call them here, liberals or lean left. And they do so also because some of the rhetoric that has come out of this administration, especially in its refusal to clearly condemn white supremacists, neo-Nazis, traditional anti-Semitic bigots, has deeply scared and scarred the Jewish community. And nowhere was that more obvious than after the horrific massacre at a synagogue in Pittsburgh, which was carried out by a right-wing extremist, as was another attempted massacre at an Orthodox shul in San Diego. So Trump has stoked, I don't know if he's done so deliberately, I don't think he's done so deliberately, but Trump has stoked on the right some of the old animosities, hatreds, and bigotries that have not worked out well for Jews, historically speaking, and which have a very distinct and unsavory resonance. Now, as for Biden, I think there's a couple points that are worth making. The first is that despite some fears, I think, among many of us in the Jewish community, that the Democratic Party would be overtaken by a kind of Corbynite wing represented by Bernie Sanders. And one of the great ironies of history, the most anti-Israel candidate in modern memory happened to be the Jewish candidate. But despite those fears, Joe Biden, who has historically always painted himself as a great friend of Israel and the Jewish community, emerged as his party's standard bearer. Nonetheless, it is the case that behind Biden, there are changes in the Democratic Party that really disturb, or at least ought to disturb, American Jews. This is the progressive wing, the large wing of it that remains Sandinista, as we call it here, and you saw no better example of it than just a few days ago, the New York City Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is clearly an up-and-coming force in the Democratic Party, pulled out of a commemoration of the assassination of the 25th anniversary of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, because she had essentially been pushed to do so by the usual hyper left-wing pro-Palestinian extremists who didn't want to remember Rabin as a peacemaker, a late-in-life peacemaker, but instead insisted that he was just another, bloodthirsty Israeli general. So when you have a leading Democratic light unwilling to participate in an event for Yitzhak Rabin, of all people, it tells you something about the direction of at least certain segments of the Democratic Party. And more than that, and I think this is important for those of you listening in on this call to note, there is a new movement in the Democratic Party, or on the left, that is intensely identity conscious, that is what we call intersectional in its belief that there is a kind of inverted pyramid of victimization, and that has recently taken to calling American Jews people who have been, quote unquote, invited into whiteness, which is really an extension of an anti-Semitic trope that goes back, that has distinct resonances in Germany and other communities where the Jews have obviously tragic and sorrowful histories. So this is also happening within the Democratic Party, and we would be absolutely foolish not to look it squarely in the eye. And if you want a clearer sense of this, I commend an article by my dear friend and former colleague Barry Weiss in the online periodical Tablet. It's called Stop Being Shocked. And after my talk, if you want to spend a worrisome half hour, go to the Tablet magazine website and read her piece there. Now, a third theme that I'd like to just touch on today is the question of America and its role in the wider world. Because one of the points that I feel has frequently been overlooked about the direction of the United States, at least ideologically, if not in terms of actual policy, but the ideological direction of the United States in the Trump years, is that there is much more consonance with the Obama administration than initially meets the eye. For 8 years, the Obama administration made it its mission to shrink America's global footprint, to withdraw American troops from Europe, to withdraw American forces, certainly from the Middle East, and to focus on what it liked to call nation building at home. In its own way, the Obama administration was engaged in a kind of America First policy. It just didn't have the baldness, if you will, of calling it America First, because America First has such an unpleasant historical precedent. The Trump administration, again, I'm speaking ideologically and rhetorically, has largely followed that lead. The United States will be withdrawing all of its forces from Afghanistan. We are minimizing our commitments in places like South Korea, drawing them down in Japan. The Trump administration sometimes appears to be following a traditional Republican foreign policy analysis or direction, but it's very different from the foreign policy of either of the two Bushes or of Reagan or of Nixon. It's closer to a kind of truculent nationalism than it is to a kind of muscular liberal internationalism. And there are important distinctions there that I think will play out over time. The central point that I'm trying to make is that no matter who wins next month, you can expect an America that is much more diffident, recalcitrant, uninterested in engaging in the wider world, certainly less interested in bearing the traditional burdens of post-war American policy than any that you have seen before. And I think this is going to have deep implications for Europe. I think it's going to have implications for the UK. This is going to play out for a long period of time. You know, in 1947, the Britain, exhausted by World War II, did have an ace card in which they could, with relative ease, hand over the burdens of the post-war world to a confident and booming United States, and do so, you know, with a sense that some of the core values and attitudes about the world would be shared between Washington and London. Who does the United States hand over these responsibilities to? It's not at all clear to me that there is anyone else. And so in the absence of some other power that is willing to defend a liberal and internationalist world order, what you're going to get is an increasingly chaotic world order in which more and more it's every nation unto itself. And one of the reasons I have been concerned about the direction of Trump's foreign policy vis-a-vis Israel, which is obviously very close to my heart and my concerns, is that although Trump is personally sympathetic to Israel, his worldview is, in a sense, unsympathetic to Israel. Trump has sort of carved out an exception for Israel as a country that gets the benefit of American largesse and American protection. But at some future date, some other Republican or Democratic president might say, well, if it's going to be America first, why should we treat Israel any differently than we treat, say, South Korea or Montenegro, or you name it? And that's, I think, a worrisome fact, given that Israel has always existed in the shadow of an American hegemon that was prepared to provide a kind of a margin of safety between civilization and the forces of fanaticism and totalitarianism. I think it's something that really ought to worry us all. So I want to just make a couple of, or at least one major concluding remark. I've noticed that whenever I speak to Jewish audiences, if I'm not as depressing as possible, I feel I've failed in my task. But every century that I can think of has come with a world historic calamity. And it's worth thinking what this century's calamity might be, and whether we are not, in some sense, if not on the eve of it, at least if we haven't at least brought together the ingredients of a weakened global economic system, a more truculent ideological sphere, ambitious militant revisionist regimes intent on changing the world order, and democracies that are diffident, inward-looking, and tired, and whether those ingredients now on the table might not be cooked into something really very, very dangerous for us all. The second remark I want to make is this, and perhaps it's a more positive remark. The one thing that I think has happened in 2020, which is unmistakably good, good for the world and good for the Jews, is that Israel has once again defied its critics and its skeptics, and has made this extraordinary peace with Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. I suspect it's shortly going to be followed by Oman, possibly Sudan, and ultimately might well be by Saudi Arabia, effectively bringing an end to the traditional Arab-Israeli conflict. And Israel was able to do this not by winning the world's love, not by winning any popularity contests, not by taking ever more grandiose or risky bets on a peace deal with the Palestinians. It was able to do so by standing up for itself, by insisting on being respected, irrespective of whether it was loved or whether it was popular. I think this is a lesson that has some meaning for all of us who are Jews. You know, in the last year, it's easy to forget, but the English, I think the British Jewish community stood up magnificently in the face of the takeover or the near takeover of the Labour Party by people who, at least from my vantage, look to me like unrepentant anti-Semites. And the result is a new Labour Party that is making amends, a faction of that party that has been not only trounced electorally, but sidelined ideologically, and a Jewish community that showed what can be done when it stands up for itself and makes its feelings very clear. And so, you know, sometimes people think that it's Americans who always take the lead and the Europeans or the rest of the diaspora community that follows. I think maybe the best way to end my remarks is by saying this is a great example of an occasion where it was British Jews who took the lead. And I can only hope that when the time comes, as it will, that American Jews can look to your example as a way of conducting ourselves and standing up for our own rights and concerns in the face of all the encroaching darkness. So on that note of darkness, I will stop there and turn it over to you, Rabbi, for whatever questions you have.
Thank you so much, Bret, for a very lucid, a very insightful analysis and overview. And it's true that we are really curious here. Personally, of course, as an American, but more broadly speaking, I think the world does follow what happens in the States very closely. I do want to say on a personal note, I really was happy with your concluding note, not the darkness bit as much as the looking to the British Jewish community for their leadership, I guess, if you will. On a personal note, I have to say there were a few times I was traveling in a cab and taxi drivers would turn to me and they would ask me, what are your feelings about this Corbynism and the elections, etc. I'm visibly, as you can tell, a walking advertisement for Judaism. And so it was clear to me that they were asking, what is your view about the anti-Semitism, etc. And on a number of occasions, these taxi drivers turned to me and they said, I just want you to know, I have voted Labor for 30 years and in one instance, 50 years. And they said, this time around, I have reconsidered. And in one case, someone said, I've chosen to vote for a different party precisely because of its take on the Jewish people. That to me was outstanding. And there are certain statistics that I think bear out that this issue was central in the switch of a particular demographic, I don't know the numbers offhand, who voted on principle and based on conscience rather than tribalism, which I do hope does serve as a model going forward in the States and around the world for conscience-based and principle-based voting rather than party politics, which sadly has become so pervasive.